Welcome to Medical Intuition Illuminated, the podcast bringing light to the wisdom of the body. I'm your host, Laura Wise, a medical intuitive and psychic medium dedicated to helping you understand the subtle and layered ways your body communicates. Here, we explore the meeting point of intuition, physiology, and energy, approaching the body not as a puzzle to fix, but as a wise, expressive system that's always speaking. This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. It is not medical advice, and it does not replace professional healthcare, diagnosis, or treatment. Always consult a qualified healthcare provider for any medical concerns. Hello there. On this episode, I wanted to take some time to talk about my own personal ethical framework that I have developed when doing both medical intuition and mediumship work, and also discuss how it is that I came to have this ethical framework and some of the considerations that I take into account when doing the work and talking about the work. So let's get into it. So for me, with everything that I do in medical intuition and also in mediumship in my practice, I always want to deeply consider the ethical implications of what it is that I'm doing. I think that ethics have always been a really core part of my spiritual development. And the deeper that I go into it, the more important it becomes to me. And I think there is such a spectrum of ethical considerations when it comes to doing kind of this energy work and spiritual work that is gaining popularity right now. And it's really important to me that I am always trying to be considerate and make informed decisions about how I'm approaching it and how much respect I have for my clients and for the people that I work with. And this is really important to me because I have personally witnessed a lot of unethical behavior within this space. These are spaces that are unregulated. There aren't any certifications that you can do. There's nobody that's coming to say, making sure that people are, practicing ethically, that they are using language that is supportive, and that there aren't any, there's not any harm that's being done as a result of the work and what happens within those sessions. And so because I've, both experienced and witnessed this unethical behavior happen, it's, I know what it feels like to have that trust questioned, a lot of times when we are having these deep spiritual experiences or these deep interactions in this realm, it can be really vulnerable. It can be really vulnerable to energetically open up yourself to somebody, to be seen by somebody to that level and degree, and to, you're basically allowing that person to potentially influence how it is that you're interacting with these topics and these parts of self. And a lot of what comes up can be very, very deeply personal. It usually is, because that's kind of what we're trying to do, is to unpack all of the different layers of the psyche and the body and the spirit. And anytime things are personal and vulnerable like that, I think that there needs to be extra care that is considered. And so while a lot of the work is being really clear and straightforward and bringing messages and information through, there still has to be a certain amount of consideration and a certain amount of careful phrasing and careful thoughtfulness with how those topics are presented and communicated. And, that takes practice, that takes understanding, that takes awareness. And it's not something that kind of happens immediately. It's something that's kind of honed and set intention around. So there are several different ways that I keep ethics at the forefront of my considerations in my practice. And some of the big ones really are around permissions. And I'll speak to this more deeply in a moment. Permissions are really huge. The other way, again, is kind of, I mentioned, how I'm phrasing things, how I'm bringing things up, the sensitivity that I'm bringing to it, and having kind of a trauma-informed lens around things. Because oftentimes I am discovering trauma within the body, and to broach that with somebody that is, we're in the process of healing that trauma, or that maybe hasn't gone near it in a while. You want to be very careful with how that's held, because it can influence how that person views themselves, how they view that experience, and they can then make, personal decisions off of that perspective. And then another way this shows up is also kind of how I engage with other practitioners, how much I talk about the sessions that I do have, or more like how little I talk about the sessions that I do have, more than anything. And then how I kind of talk about the body as a framework, in general, how I speak to different aspects that might be sensitive about bodies, because our bodies are, can be a very tender subject for us. Health can be a very tender subject, and we're all human. We're all figuring this out. We're all trying our best, and we have to acknowledge the human element as well is really important. So starting with permissions are core to the work that I do. And you'll hear within the session episodes that I share that I always will get permission from the person that I'm reading. And I include those within the session episode so that it's very clear that I'm doing that and that the person is giving me verbal consent. I know some practitioners consider that when a person has booked with them, they're already kind of giving permission by the fact that they've booked with them. But I also just feel like I want to get very clear, expressed permission in the moment from that person. And I will always get permission every single time I do a session with somebody. So even if it's a client that is coming back to me, it's a client that I've worked with before, and I do have clients that I've, had many sessions with, I will always get permission again in that moment. And this is, because, that I don't view energy as that energy exchange as something that's kind of that door is always open. I think that I really believe in the autonomy of our own energy responsibility, like being responsible for our own personal energy and our own personal energy field. And so it's important to me that I am engaging with that person in this moment, in that time, that they're really consenting to the experience that we're traversing together. Along those lines, I will even sometimes get layered permission within a session. So I will get permission at the beginning of the session, and then as we're going, I might get to an area of the body or an experience or something that is a little more tender or a little sensitive, and the body is telling me, hey, I've got some protections around this, I've got some walls up, right? And I want to respect the body, and the body has put those walls there for a reason. They put that protection there for a reason, and I want to be very respectful of that and the person. And so that might be a situation where I would again say, hey, do I have, I would say, like, I notice that there's protections around this area and this topic. Do I have your permission to look more deeply in that area? And I will get permission from them again. And that gives us kind of this opportunity to also pause and acknowledge, hey, we're going into some territory that might feel a little more sensitive. Not only does it get that extra layer of permission and allow the body to relax and trust, but it also gives the person time to mentally prepare and say, okay, we're going to be talking about some things that might feel a little bit more triggering, or some things that are going to be a little more tender. And that gives them the agency to be able to also feel like they're, having control in the session. This is not just me kind of spouting all these things at them. This is a conversation we're having together. This is an experience we're having together. And I'm not doing it to them. We're doing it with each other, right? So along those lines, privacy is also very important to me. I, kind of follow some similar guidelines that the medical system has in place, in that I don't talk about my clients. I don't share, who has seen me, who has had a session with me. If they want to share that and they want to, tell other people about it, I think that's great. And I, always love hearing about that. But that's up to them if they want to share it or not. We talk about some really private things, and especially with the body. And not everybody, wants other people to know that they saw a medical intuitive or they saw a psychic medium. And that's perfectly fine. I totally get it. These topics and these spheres are still gaining ground within the public and the collective. And while they're much more accepted than they were, say, 5 or 10 years ago, we still have some ways to go with the way that people view this work and their understanding of what it is that's happening. And sometimes people need time to process, what it is that happened. So they get to share that experience when and how they're ready to. Along with privacy, you'll notice that all of my sessions that I share on the podcast are anonymous. And I, am very careful to always give full control of what is shared to the participants that I have for the podcast. So if anything comes up at any time during the sessions that feels too personal or vulnerable, or if some way it's going to kind of break that anonymity for them, it's a detail that is identifying, they can tell me, they have full control to tell me that they don't want to include that's not something they want shared on the podcast. And that was very important to me from the beginning to include that as an option. You'll also notice that I don't include the healing portion of my sessions within the podcast. So my sessions are 2 parts. The first half is kind of this deep dive assessment, which is what you'll be hearing on the podcast. And then during that deep dive, there are several areas that are usually identified that we'll work on for the healing portion. And that healing portion I do not share, because it almost immediately within that section gets very personal and detailed. So within that, I'll identify kind of where the organ system is, and we'll look at the specific kind of inception point or event that caused that energy and that stagnation to happen within the body. And I'll pull an age for it as well. And usually when I pull the age, almost immediately that person will know what we're talking about. Sometimes those ages are actually before, what we consider like conscious memory, before, say 5 or 6 years old. And then sometimes it can get a little fuzzy about that, but often usually people know enough about the dynamics, within their family or within their childhood that would point to what that event or incident was that we're working with. And so, kind of immediately there's a lot of information there about that person, and those topics can get really intense because the events that we're looking at, are usually have some level of intensity or trauma attached to them, or they wouldn't have gotten, stuck in the body to begin with. These are big experiences, or experiences that the body considers to be impactful. They might be something that in retrospect looks small, but at the time the body made some kind of assumption about the world, or had some kind of understanding or aha moment, or a belief system was created at that moment that really kind of creates a pattern that drives that person in a certain direction, or creates a certain framework for their thinking. And so these things can get tender really quickly. And so even during that healing portion, I, go really methodically. We get, we make sure that we're, talking about these things in a respectful way, that the person is, still giving consent for us to have that conversation. And also, within that healing portion, I really emphasize that my role is as a guide, rather than kind of, again, this healer that is doing the healing on somebody, because I want them to have ownership over their own experience in their own body. I would love it if people take this experience and realize that they can use it for other things. If they have things that come up and we're not in session, and they are like, oh, identified that this experience lodged this thing in my body, and I feel it, feel it coming up, that they can use the work that we did together to, do their own healing in the future. Cause that's my true dream and mission, is to be able to share these techniques and tools so that people can take ownership of their own healing process. That's the ultimate goal here. And again, I'm just one person, so I'm not going to be able to ever see all the people that could benefit from my work. So the more that I'm able to share it, and the more that I'm able to give people the tools that they need to work with their own healing, the better, in my opinion. And that kind of works into my ethical framework as well, in that I'm not here to be a gatekeeper, and I have techniques that I've developed over the years that, work for me, and that, I learned some of them from other people. I've adapted them. I've developed them on my own. And my only hesitation with sharing those is to make sure that people have the right context and framework to be able to apply them properly, rather than wanting to keep those to myself for the sake of kind of, being this, person behind the toll booth, to keeping people from the access to this. And so that's really my ultimate goal, is for people to be able to own their bodies again. I think that the way that medicine has often been practiced, especially within the last 100 years, has really taken the patient and the person and the client or whatever out of the driver's seat of their own body. There's a lot of terminology that's used that further kind of disconnects a person from themselves and their own body. And I think that people really know what's going on with themselves a lot more than we are given credit for, and you hear all the time of stories of people going back to doctors and constantly saying like something is wrong, them getting dismissed and not getting the respect that they know their body, that they know something's going on. So I feel like ethics are important in all of the kind of spiritually themed work that we're doing. But when we're talking about people's bodies, I feel like it's extra, extra important. And like I mentioned, bodies can be really sensitive. There's a lot of personal stuff that comes with it. And there's also privacy is also really important. You know, not everybody wants to share what is going on health wise with themselves. So they might be more likely to share kind of what's going on spiritually or mentally or even emotionally. But when it comes to the body, it feels very sacred and sensitive. And beyond that, there are potential legal implications for that as well. And, in medical industries, there's the HIPAA laws, but these are, again, unregulated spaces. And I have definitely seen some practitioners that have not been super respectful with what it is that they share about their clients or about the experiences that they have had in doing readings. And that can make a person feel really vulnerable if they're not consenting to that. So another piece of ethics for me is the disclaimer. And I have a disclaimer at the beginning of every session. When people book with me, I have them also check a box saying that they've read a disclaimer. And this disclaimer is basically saying, I'm not a licensed medical practitioner. I'm not going to diagnose. I'm not going to say I can cure anything. We're not going to talk about named conditions unless it's something they bring up and they want to talk about the energy of. Oftentimes those, things they already know about come up in the session anyways, and then they'll be like, oh, okay, I've already been diagnosed with X, Y, and Z. And so that makes sense that you're seeing this pattern. And especially with the diagnosis piece is so, so important to me because for many reasons. The first is that it's, that's not the role that I'm playing here is to diagnose. Again, like I'm not a licensed medical practitioner. I don't have that legal authority to be diagnosing anyone. And it's not safe or helpful for me to be doing that in this moment. And I do know of medical intuitives who have diagnosed people. And whether or not they were right, they created a lot of fear for that person in the moment. And it caused them a lot of mistrust and anxiety. So again, diagnosis is something that is not within what it is that we're doing with the work. Additionally, in the Western medicine view of the body, there are many diagnoses that when you break them down, they're not actually helpful from the way that I'm seeing the body, right? So there's a lot of diagnoses that, especially things that are like itis that end in itis, right? So like pancreatitis, things along those lines. And that usually often just means kind of inflammation of whatever body part or system that is, right? So it's just saying that there's inflammation. And from a baseline, the information, just knowing that there's inflammation isn't always going to be that helpful for a person to be able to work with it, right? Inflammation can happen for a lot of reasons from a traditional medicine focus, right? There's, inflammation that comes from heat. There's inflammation that comes from cold, damp, and there's all kinds of reasons that inflammation can be there, and it's going to be handled in a different way depending on what it is that's in the body. And so if we're looking at it from purely kind of this Western medicine lens, it often is a good starting place for the way that they practice medicine to say a diagnosis like that. But when we're just looking at these energies, it's more useful for us to understand kind of why that inflammation is there to begin with, so we can work with it for that person's individual needs. Piece of my ethical framework is that prior to sessions, I prefer to know as little as possible about my client and what they have going on. So I'll generally start, with as little of an intro as possible. Sometimes I might ask if there is a specific area they want to make sure that I leave time to discuss or something like that, but we won't go into the specifics of it until we're actually in session first, and I get to take a look at what the energetics of that look like. And I the one of the main reasons I do this is because I want to be able to fully lean into trusting the information that's coming through. Intuitive work, can be fuzzy sometimes as far as, where it's coming from. And so I really want to, make sure that this is actually coming from, my guides and me reading the body, rather than it coming from my conscious mind or any assumptions that I might have made. And there are times, especially when I have kind of repeat clients or, clients that I might know a little bit more about from my personal life, where it's impossible for me to come in completely without knowing anything about the person. And when that happens, I really try to be upfront with acknowledging I already know this piece about you, and calling that out specifically so that we can be clear about what kind of knowledge I'm coming in with that already. So it's very important to me that I am making sure that I'm not making any assumptions, again, from my conscious mind about this, that this is coming from what it is that I'm reading in the moment from the body. And I have heard of medical intuitives that they'll do something akin to like a intake form prior to sessions where they'll have the person kind of fill out all of their medical history. And that to me is kind of really against the point of what we're doing here, is that we're trying to read what we're seeing in the body naturally and what comes up. And if we want to later have a conversation about what that person has going on, if they bring up something that they've already been diagnosed with and they want information about it, you'll hear that happen in the sessions that I have on the podcast as well. That's fine with doing that. But usually at that point in the session, that's towards the end. And at that point, I feel like I've already built up enough trust with my client or my participant that they feel comfortable asking me those questions and knowing that they're going to get an intuitive read on that based on what they've already heard from our conversations together. And so that's something that is also, a very clear boundary. So in my intake, I ask very little information prior to the session. I just, have them sign the disclaimer, and also, acknowledge kind of a cancellation and rescheduling policy. But other than that, I don't intake any information at this point, because again, it's not really for me to know that. I want to be seeing what I'm reading in the moment as well. So I also don't do anything what I would consider to be kind of a drive-by. So I've worked really hard to cultivate my energetic boundaries so that, when I'm walking around out in the regular world, I'm really trying not to pick up on other people's stuff, and sometimes it's impossible, right? Because, when that stuff is present, even with being a medium, sometimes, a person's loved one is hanging around and wants to do anything they can to communicate with that person, but I am very clear in my boundary and that I'm not the medium that's going to walk up to somebody on the street and be like, your grandmother wants me to tell you X, Y, and Z. I personally think it makes really great TV, right? When people do that. But I think that ethically, I don't feel like people are always in the mindset to be able to be having that conversation. And so those messages aren't always going to land the way that they should. In the moment. And I think that there's something to be said again for somebody consenting to have that experience and how that mentally and emotionally prepares them to receive the information in the highest possible good, rather than it just kind of coming as a one-off. And I also will sometimes get body information from people as well if their body is particularly loud. And I don't generally try to share that unless that person is already kind of opening up to me and having a conversation about those things. And then I might kind of share some of the extra details with saying, hey, I'm an intuitive and I'm picking up some things. Would you like to hear about them? And most of the time people do want to hear these things, but I'm not going to just, kind of spout that information. And prior to really fully developing, I spent a decade working in tech. And the majority of that time I was working as a user researcher or a UX researcher. And that means that I was spending a lot of time working with the general public. And I would do many, many sessions, sometimes in a day, where I would be running them through some kind of a prototype or testing some new features or just getting to understand how they might be using a particular product. And we would be in these, one-on-one sessions. And I did a lot of them remote, but in the beginning, I was doing the majority of them in person. I would actually get flown all over the country by my company to do these in person. And so it would just be kind of like me and this other person in a room. And we would have digital observers. So I might have that we do be doing a live stream, and I would be having these sessions streamed live. And a lot of my stakeholders would be people, for some pretty large tech companies that you have definitely heard of. And, there was one session in particular where I was talking to this man, and through the whole session, he kept hearing pancreas, his pancreas was just yelling at me. And I'm a professional. So in this context, I was never going to say anything. I've got these digital observers. I'm not going to say anything to him. But over the course of the session, we were talking about advertising and what kinds of ads, you might see on social media. And he kept talking about all these fast food ads he was getting. And it became very clear towards the end of the session that was like the majority of his diet was, heavily fried foods, heavily fast foods. And so to me, it was not surprising that his pancreas was at a state where it was literally crying out for help. But again, that was not what we were doing there. That person was not in a position to hear that from me. I was not in a position to say it for many reasons. And that would not have been appropriate for us to have that conversation. So I do think about that man sometimes, and I hope that his health is doing well. But for the vast majority of the time, I have much better boundaries than I did at that point. And I really try not to hear and listen to what's going on in other people's bodies as much as I possibly can, because it's none of my business to observe that, and when it's with mediumship and when these loved ones are coming to me, if they're very insistent, I will say, you tell your person to come to me, for a session. Or you find another avenue to communicate this, because that's not what we're doing here in this moment. So I really am clear with the spirits that they need to approach this in a different way, and I'm not going to do a drive-by. And so that's been a boundary for me as well, ethically. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how I kind of approach this work and the ethical framework that I have always kind of within my sphere as I'm doing sessions and talking about sessions and thinking about the body. And this is also to say that, many different practitioners have their own personal framework that they've developed, their own relationship to the work that they have over time. And that might not be the same as my own. But this is what I have developed to at this point in time. And that's also to say that I am a student of the universe. And so I will always, always be learning more. I will always be expanding my viewpoint. And also that's part of my ethical framework as well, in that I want to have a flexible ability to grow and evolve the way that I relate to these topics and this work continuously. So, these are things that I want to continually revisit and kind of as I learn more things, as I have more experiences, incorporate those into my own framework as well, and continue to expand it, because I'm not always going to know everything in the moment, but I always am dedicated to, learning more and evolving in every opportunity that I can. Thanks for listening to Medical Intuition Illuminated. If this episode resonated, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who might benefit. Special thanks to Derek Ryan for music. Until next time, listen deeply to the wisdom of your body.